Reference material for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. I think Elaine has one, but you can have one too if you want. Appreciate it, Isaac.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. So we have about 300 years to carry this morning, so we're kind of going to be on we'll pace it, but next thing to warn is there is a lot of names. And if you get lost, because you probably will, because I do all the time, stop me, and we'll try to catch up and make sure we know who all the players are that we're talking about. And these names are going to be strange to a lot of folks because they're representing the fragments of the Greek Empire. And so in honor of Anthony, I'll just say they're all Greek to me, right? So last week, we left with Alexander the Great having died. So Ken brought us up to that. One thing that happens is in the stories that come out of Maccabees, which is the main text that drives us through this morning, the stories there are really written to kind of bolster the Maccabean Empire, right? The Maccabean Kingdom, I should say. And so a lot of details don't exactly match up with history, but they're in themes very close. But one of the things that the Maccabees kind of skip over is they basically say, well, Alexander, before he died, divided his empire up. Well, that's not actually what happened. It was a pretty ugly affair. So when Alexander died, for the next 20 years, what they call diadochi, which means his followers, his supporters, they started fighting over the kingdom. And the way they did that was by trying to gain control of the lineage that they felt like could be supported back to the Macedonians. Okay, so now Alexander, when he died, he didn't have any heirs, but he did have an unborn son. So about 2 months after he died, the son was born. Well, one of his generals, Antigenes, tries to take control of the empire by controlling being a regent over that son. Well, that got everybody up in arms, and so the diadochi start fighting, and through a series of murders and assassinations, and you can't make this stuff up in Hollywood, it comes down to a great war that happens, and the diadochi finally have a great battle about 20 years later, and in the result of that is they do get the kingdom divided up into fourths. And so you've got Antigonus takes this area here. This is where he was based, and as you can tell, he was the one trying to take control of the entire kingdom by being the regent over the infant son of Antony. You've got Seleucus, who was a cavalry officer. He wasn't actually even one of the original generals when this all started, but he had taken over, and even though he got driven out originally by Antigonus, he had fled to Egypt and got the support of Ptolemy. Ptolemy turns around and supports him, and he winds up with this entire kingdom of Syria, okay? Antony's son eventually does get murdered by Antigonus, who's trying to solidify his control. And so Antony's heirs really are gone at that point. And this battle went back and forth between these kingdoms of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids for the next 100 years or so. Actually, it's a little bit more than that. So now this is where the back and forth starts happening. We're not going to have time to hit every detail, but boy, they are fascinating. So if you have time at some point, you can go back and look at that. And the handout I gave you maps Daniel chapter 11, which Ken talked about a couple of weeks ago, actually 3 weeks ago? 2 or 3 weeks ago. And maps out in great detail the back and forth that's happening over this century. Okay? So we're not going to read through Daniel 11 and try to map directly out because we just don't have time this morning. But I've given you the handout so that you can follow it. You can look at it in the future, try to map it back. And I tell you, if you start going and look at the details of this stuff, you'll be fascinated. You won't be able to put it down. It'll be a must-read that you're just going to keep going with. Okay, so let's hit this. So about 25 years after they had finally settled the boundaries, what normally happens when kingdoms are next to each other and everybody's human nature of power and greed takes over, they start fighting again. Okay, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, who are bordering each other, just can't seem to keep their hands off each other. Okay, the first war happens when Ptolemy the second comes up from Egypt. Let me go back. He comes up from Egypt because there's been a transition of power among the Seleucids. So when the Seleucus I had died and his son Antiochus I takes over, he takes as an opportunity, and this one doesn't involve Palestine this time. He's actually attacking up in here into Asia Minor, trying to take control of the Mediterranean, okay? He's beat. So he does get part of Asia Minor, but he eventually has to retreat and come back. So he's got portions here of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey for people who want to try to map that. So everybody retreats. We're not done, though. Antiochus I dies, okay? And a little help on the name. If you say Antiochus or Seleucus, you're normally talking about Daniel's kings of the north, which are the Seleucids. And if you're using the words Ptolemy, you're usually talking about the kings of the south. Now, in a couple hundred years, things get really muddled because people start taking Greek names, and you can't really rely on that anymore. But during this time period, that's generally true. So Antiochus has died. Ptolemy says, I'm going to try again. So he comes back up into Asia Minor, and he strikes again. Now, they do lose portions of Asia Minor during that incursion. Antiochus is able to beat him back, so he was able to push him back down. He had actually beat him so bad that he could have went ahead and made an incursion down into Egypt, and probably, historians believe, could have taken it. But as things happen often during this time period, trouble at home, there was some usurpers that were coming in, and he was fighting a rebellion back in his own home territory. So what he did was he made an agreement with the king of the south, Ptolemy, that he would withdraw, and Ptolemy gave him his daughter, Berenice, as kind of a trade to make an alliance, okay? Now, 10 goes by or so, and Ptolemy Ptolemy's side dies, okay? The one that Antiochus had just lost to, the Antiochus II lost to, Ptolemy II, he dies, okay? In this time period, treaties among the Greeks were personal treaties. So this was king to king. So when he died, he's freed from the obligations of the treaty. He's also now has this wife, Berenice, and what I left out a detail that was very important detail. When he was given her as his wife the first time, he was already married to a noblewoman. Her name was Laodice, and she was not happy about this, but she was put into exile and kept there with her son and stuff. But when Ptolemy II dies, the treaty's over, and Antiochus II says, I liked my first wife better. So he goes and tries to reconcile with her. Well, that didn't go over that well with her. She carried a little bit of a grudge, and she winds up killing Antiochus II. Okay? So there's a lesson for you of spurning your wife, right? The grudges hold a long time among certain members of that community, especially the royal wives. So she kills him, and she installs her son, who actually is Antiochus, who is a rightful heir at that point, to the throne, and that is, so she poisons him. He chases now what happens here to start this war is when all that happened, remember who she was, Berenice, the one who was killed. She was the daughter of Ptolemy, and that was his, his sister at this point, because the father had died. This was the Ptolemy, boy, this is confusing, I know, and I'm sorry. Ptolemy's sister now was the one who had been killed, along with Ptolemy's nephew, because when Laodicea took control back, she killed both the mother and the son, who could have been rivals to the throne, and put them out of the way. So Ptolemy doesn't like this, right? His sister and his nephew, who were ruling the land that was next to him, had just been killed. So what does he do? He invades. Okay? He goes in, he chases them all over, but he's unable to resolve the situation, and he eventually has to withdraw. But in that process, there was a lot of people that had died because of this, inter-family politics going on. So years go by. Ptolemy the Fourth now. I guess I can go back to that chart. Ptolemy the Fourth ascends to the throne. Ptolemy III dies. Years are going by. So I said we have 300 years of history here. So we're going rapid, but this is, many, many years are going by here. But Ptolemy the Fourth is a drunken mess. I mean, this guy, by all accounts, historically, he only cared about himself. He taxed like crazy to pay for his lavish lifestyle, and he was just, wasn't liked at home or abroad. And so one of his generals that was controlling the area around Judea goes to Antiochus the third and says, I'm done with this guy. If you want Judea, I'll turn it over to you. Okay? So Antiochus III jumps at this chance. Here he's got this corridor now being offered to him. He jumps in, goes to take control, and at that time, Ptolemy comes back and recaptures the land, drives them out, and basically Ptolemy is thankful to the chief high priest in Jerusalem at that time for his support, and he makes all these promises. He says, "I'm going to relieve you from taxes. I'm going to let you rebuild the damage that's been done to the city and the walls and the temple and all of that." Makes all these grand promises, but then he doesn't come through with any of them. So that sparked a lot of Jewish resentment. They knew they couldn't trust him anymore, and so time goes by. The Jews are getting a little bit upset with all of this. He dies. So Ptolemy IV dies, and now we're into the fifth war here. So in this transition of power, Antiochus III says, okay, here's my opportunity. A lot of the people that would support the Ptolemies in Jerusalem at that time had financial interest, and they'd all passed on by this point. So the next generation come in, they didn't like the Ptolemies, all these promises that weren't kept. So they sided with Antiochus, and they even go and convince another one of the generals who's on the Ptolemaic side to defect, and they're able to take control. Okay, so at this point, Judea now, or the area of Palestine. Judea, when I say Judea, that's using a term that actually doesn't come into existence until later when the Romans create a province here, but it's reflecting the general area around Jerusalem. And Ken went over that with the maps and kind of showed you the difference between Judea and Galilee and the other areas. But really the entire area of Palestine is what we're talking about, which includes that whole coastal area all the way to the seas there, to the Dead Sea and to the Sea of Galilee. So now we've got Palestine under the Seleucid control, okay? So boy, that was a lot of history and a lot of bounce back and forth that went to get to this point. But from here on, until we see the Jews being able to revolt and get away, which we'll cover by the end of the day, hopefully, the area remains either under Seleucid control or as a client state of the Seleucids, okay? Now, one of the things that happens that people see, and it may come up later, I can't remember, but Antiochus III at this point in order to seal the deal, there's another exchange of kinfolk. He gives his daughter to Ptolemy IV as a wife, and that daughter's name was Cleopatra IV, okay? Not to be confused with a bunch of other Cleopatras that are going to pop up, and the most famous one was actually Cleopatra VII, which we won't cover until, we may not even cover it all, but maybe next week during the discussion of the Romans. Okay? Whew. All right, like I said, the handout that I gave you follows the Daniel 11, which is actually very, very detailed in terms of prophecies and maps throughout all that we just talked about. Okay? All right. So here we are. Antiochus III now is the ruler of the Seleucids. So for the first few years here, the Jews actually had it. I'm sorry? Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
On the previous slide,
Uh-huh.
all those, I don't know how you pronounce it. Are those the 1, 2, 3, 4, or is that all the same guy?
No, those are not the same guy. Those are actually, it goes from 1, 2 is actually in both the first and the second. 3rd is the 3rd, and then the 4th and 5th are 2 of one side and 1 of one's other side. That handout I gave you, I think, points out who's in each of those back and forths. The Ptolemy. Yeah. 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 So it doesn't map directly, but it's pretty close. All right. So Antiochus III comes in. He actually is pretty good to the Jews. He gives them some relief from their taxes for a while so that they can help rebuild Jerusalem, who's been through this back and forth. And over the last probably 200 years to this point, Jerusalem has changed hands a dozen or more times between various warlords during the early days, during the Diadochi battles, and then the Seleucid Egyptians seizing and then freeing the city as part of their ongoing war. So they're really beat up at this point. So Antiochus III comes in, says, okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of relief here. I'm going to help you. He allows them, he mandates, or he puts into actually written code that they're exempted from the cultic worship. And when I say the cultic worship, during this time period, the kings were considered part of the deity, and so they were worshipped along with the rest of the gods. So Zeus and Apollos and Artemis and etc. But Antiochus III comes in and he says, understand, you guys don't do this. I'm exempting you from it. You're not required to do that. On the Jewish side, we haven't talked a whole lot during this period because the Jewish high priest had pretty much continued down through the line coming back from when Nehemiah returned and installed. At this point, Simon II is the high priest, and he's actually called Simon the Wise or Simon the Great because he actually oversees a lot of the rebuilding of Jerusalem during this time and was considered a very wise ruler of the Jews as a high priest. Okay, now we get into the interesting stuff that's been foreshadowed by Ken for a few weeks. So Antiochus III, even though he was kind to the Jews, he was a pretty ruthless guy, and he wanted more territory. He was very hungry, and one of the things he wanted to do was to go back and take that area of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, all the way to Greece, and he wanted to pretty much take the old Antigonus Empire and bring it into his sphere, okay? The Romans are a major power in the world at this point. They pretty much own the Western Mediterranean. They're not happy with this because this puts him right up against them. They would rather have a buffer zone there, and they'd rather have a weak ruler that they could control, which was not Antiochus III. And so they're very, very nervous about this. And so Antiochus comes in. He does take Thrace. So I don't have a map because it was hard to get it on the thing, but Thrace is right on the northeast side of Greece, across the the Gulf there from Turkey. So he actually got pretty close, and the Romans said that's far enough. So they went off and confronted him, and they actually stopped him. They beat him in 2 different battles, and at those 2 battles, at Thermopylae and Magnesia, the Romans basically shut him down completely and pushed him back out. So he's part of that activity, though. Whenever he gets stopped by the Romans said, listen, you're going to pay for this mess you've caused. So as part of his treaty that he had to sign to get himself out of this mess, which, the Romans could have continued to push him because they were that strong at that point, he makes a treaty with them that includes some pretty heavy war reparations. So he's got this huge bill now that he's got to pay to the Romans. And he's trying to pay that bill, and so he's going around to all the different temples. Now, this isn't just the temple in Jerusalem. This is all the temples of his empire, and he's raiding their treasuries. And he gets to one over in the eastern part of his empire. It was a temple to Zeus, and the mobs there were not happy, and they wind up killing him. So they were pretty zealous to keep their treasure at their temple. Okay, so now his son, well, what happens here now is Seleucus IV inherited this. So his son Seleucus IV now has to pay these reparations because the Romans, unlike the Greeks, when their treaties were made, they were made state to state, not person to person, not king to king. So their treaties went beyond the death of the ruler and still, just like today, we would say the contract's good as long as it was between the parties or between the nations, not between the individuals. Okay, so Seleucus IV now inherits this huge debt, and he goes in and starts trying to make collections, and this did not go well with his people, particularly the Jewish. And there was a lot of fighting that was starting among the Jewish community now of how to deal with these various parties. And so you start seeing rifts happening within the Jewish leadership, and they're basically fighting. And during this fight, there was a Benjamite named Simon, and Onias III was the high priest, and they both were on different sides of this. Onias III was saying, we can't give them the treasure, we got to maintain our own, base of funds. One little side note here is during this time, a lot of the rich and powerful of Jerusalem kept their deposits in the temple treasury, so it was almost like a big bank. And Onias III was not willing to give that up. Simon, this Benjamite, he had more favorable toward the Greeks, and he also didn't, maybe he saw that this was not a good thing to be picking a fight with the Greeks. So he goes to the Seleucid officials and says, hey, they're hiding this big treasure in the temple. You should go get it. Well, obviously that causes a problem. And he sends an official called Heliodorus, who's going to come into play in a little bit here, to collect the money out of the temple. And in Maccabees, the discussion, the story is relayed there that a miraculous event happens. An angel comes down on this horse and basically stands in his way, beats the guy up. And Onias III comes in, makes a treaty entreats the angel to stop and prevents his, from killing him, nurses him back to health. History, is written by the victors, so who knows what really happened, but history basically says that a big angry mob stopped Heliodorus from entering the temple, and Onias did step in and stop them from beating him up, but the result of the situation is they didn't get their money and they went away, so that continued the fight there. In the meantime, Seleucus IV, who's got this huge obligation to Rome, he misses a couple of payments. And in order to resolve that situation, they demand that he send them some high-level hostages. So Seleucus sends Mithridates, okay? I know these names are but he basically sends his brother, son, over as a hostage. His name is Mithridates. Okay. That's going to be important later, actually on the next slide. But then Seleucus IV is assassinated by that same guy who got beat up by the Jews in Jerusalem when he was trying to take the treasury. Now, Heliodorus, that overseer of temples that was trying to take that, he tried to, the motives aren't clear, they're kind of lost to history exactly why he did it, but the thought is he was attempting to make a play for the throne by eliminating Seleucus IV and being the regent over his very, very young son, whose name was Demetrius, okay? When all this happened and those payments were missed, there was another exchange of hostages, and Mithridates, who had been a hostage in Rome, was now sent in place of Demetrius. So they swapped. So Demetrius, who was the direct son of Seleucus IV, who was in line for the throne, had been sent to Rome, and Mithridates, who was just the brother, had been sent back. Okay. Is everybody with me? Okay. I know I can't make this stuff up, and it's really hard to keep track of all the players here. But now we've got a situation where Mithridates is actually free, the brother, and the son, Demetrius, the young son, is in Rome as captive. Okay? Heliodorus, when he killed Seleucus, he was trying to be the regent for the young son who was in Rome, who was being held hostage. He actually wasn't in Rome proper, he was in Greece, but he was under Roman control. Okay? Well, the neighbors of the Seleucids during this time period, there's all this turmoil, and one of the kings that's controlling a major kingdom next to him in Pergamum basically says, what happens was they tried to get Demetrius to come back to take over the rulership, come back from Rome, and he was Demetrius was arranging all this because he'd grown up now, he was a little bit older, and Pergamum says, no, we're not doing that. He wants to keep this kingdom weak. So he basically says, Mithridates, who's now has been freed and is there, you're the new king. Okay? So Demetrius, the rightful heir, still off in captivity. Mithridates is now being installed as the king. Well, Mithridates takes on the name of, and this is where, if you were at Pocket Sandwich Theater or something, you'd go, hiss, boo, boo, boo. He's Antiochus IV. Okay, Antiochus Epiphanes, which Ken has talked about a couple of times leading up to this. He's the evil enemy of the Jewish state. All right. Whew. Okay. So I just talked about some of this. Mithridates is installed. This is about 175 BC, so this is a couple centuries still before Christ is starting to teach. He immediately starts taking a completely different approach to how he governs his empire. In the past, the Greeks were very willing to let the local population pretty much rule themselves as long as they paid those taxes. Right? They did introduce a lot of culture into them. They established, gymnasiums and the philosophers and stuff. But when you think about an empire this big and a lot of the pieces of it have been conquered, there's just not enough people for them to bring in of their own to really take over. And there's really not enough incentive to the people whenever they've been conquered to abandon a lot of their old ways. So the Greeks were pretty loose about this, and they basically said, as long as you leave us in power and leave us alone, and you pay your taxes, we'll pretty much leave you alone. And that's the relationship. It was kind of a vassal-state relationship. It was like, you report to us politically, and for foreign affairs and for taxes, but otherwise you govern yourself. You deal with your own problems. Antiochus Epiphanes basically changes that policy, and he basically starts going out into his empire and saying, everybody's got to become a Greek. You have to start following our practices. You have to start doing what we're doing. And of course, this does not go over well with the people. Now, as part of this, one of the things he does is all of a sudden, the priesthood, which had always been hereditary, it had to be a son of Aaron. To this time, it was actually a son of Zadok's line had come down. Antiochus Epiphanes says, nope, I get to install the high priest. It's my job. And so Jason basically buys the priesthood. Okay, so this guy named Jason, he comes in and offers, it was several hundred talents of silver and some other things that he agreed to do in the future in terms of he was going to fund a gymnasium. He basically, in a gymnasium was a Greek, what we call a gymnasium today, except the Greeks used it as a training ground, and their standard of aesthetics was around the male body. And so they actually practiced and trained in the nude, okay? This obviously didn't go over well with the Jews, but they installed one of these in Jerusalem, and the Hellenists start becoming more and more prominent and emboldened during this time. A few years later, and you'll see that in Daniel 11:22. A few years later, another guy, Menelaus, who was actually another priest in the same line, he was sent to Antiochus IV with their payment, right? So Jason said, hey, take our payment for the taxes, go give it to Menelaus. Go give it to Antiochus IV. Well, while Menelaus is there, he basically starts talking to the guy and sees an opportunity, and he offers more money for the priesthood than Jason had given him. And so Antiochus IV, being this greedy opportunist, said, sure, you're now the high priest. So Menelaus gets some troops to help support his transition and goes back and takes over. Okay? Menelaus now has this huge financial obligation to meet because he just promised all this money to Antiochus IV, and so he robs the temple. And he basically melts down some of the implements. He doesn't do much good for the Jews at all, and clearly is a supporter of the Greeks. Okay, now, the abomination of desolation. So Antiochus Epiphanes isn't sitting still on his empire. He's still trying to look to grow it, and he makes 2 incursions into Egypt to take cities from Egypt. During the first invasion, he marches down, comes through Jerusalem, goes down to Egypt. He is able to basically win all the way down there. And the Romans, remember the Romans are up here, they're very nervous about these Greeks, continuing to take more territory. They actually have interest because they had an alliance with the Ptolemies down in Egypt at this point. But during the first incursion, they're still fighting another war. They're off busy with I think they're with the Punics at that point. And he's basically doesn't have any, Ptolemy doesn't have any support, so he loses most of his kingdom except for Alexandria. But what he does is he's able to convince Antiochus that if he takes over the whole kingdom, the Romans are not going to let that stand. So the Romans would have intervened, and so Antiochus Epiphanes makes a treaty then with the Ptolemies, and he leaves Ptolemy the sixth in place and leaves the kingdom alone. but basically says, you're going to be one of my clients, and you're going to, kind of report to me, but I'm going to leave you alone as king. He goes back. He's taken a lot of plunder. So in Daniel, in the prophecy, it talks about he, escapes with a lot of plunder. So when he's during his first invasion, he basically sacked everything in his way, and he hauled off a lot of treasure back to Antioch, okay? Now, a couple of years go by here. The Romans have finished their other war, and Antiochus makes a big mistake, and he attacks again. And he says, I'm going to go ahead and just take the rest of Egypt. So he goes back. He's not happy with Ptolemy at that point. And the Romans, at this point, are free to engage. They didn't have any troops there, though. So what happens is Ptolemy comes in. He's outside of Alexandria. He's going to be pushing in. And an embassy from the Roman Senate comes out to where he's at. He agrees to meet him. So the embassy from Rome comes and hands him basically a edict from the Roman Senate. And what this edict said was, get out, stop, go home, And Antiochus says, well, I'll think about it. And the Roman official basically goes into the sand and draws a circle around him and says, before you leave this circle, you will give us an answer. So basically, hey, get out now, or or there'll be punishment to be paid. This is your chance. Antiochus weighs it over for a few minutes and says, I'm not taking on the Romans. So he goes home. He's very angry at this point, right? Well, during this time, there was a waging battle going on within Jerusalem among the priesthood and the leaders, okay? And they were fighting. And during this time, Jason, the one who had been kicked out outbid by Menelaus, the current high priest, he's off in the countryside. He hears a rumor. In fact, the rumor had spread all through Judea that Antiochus had been killed down in Egypt. So Jason said, all right, here's my chance. Menelaus just lost his support from the Seleucids. I'm taking the high priest again. So he grabs some troops, and he goes and he sieges. He goes and attempts to make a siege. Well, Antiochus, who's on his way back, hears about this, and he's incensed that his people would be revolting against his appointment of the high priest. Okay? So he enters Jerusalem and absolutely devastates it. Of course, when it comes to numbers in a lot of the records, you have to wonder sometimes, but what Maccabees has recorded is there were 80,000 of the citizens that were killed that day, and 80,000 more were taken as slaves. So, not to be outdone with just the act of pure carnage, Antiochus IV also basically devastates the temple. He goes in, he takes all of the holy vessels that are worth anything. He takes the treasury that he'd been wanting all along anyway. He just wipes them out, and he reinstalls Menelaus, who at this point Jason had kicked out. And as a result of this, he basically says, you guys are done with all this Jewish stuff. No more circumcisions. No more sacrificing in the temple. No more of your Sabbath worship. No more of your Sabbath rest. You're gonna be Greeks, okay? And he winds up putting an altar beside the other one for Zeus, and then later himself, within the temple. And so this completely defiles the temple all the sacrifices have stopped, and this is the abomination of desolation that's spoke to in Daniel 11 through 35. Whew. Okay. Now we've got about 3 minutes to hit another thing. We may stop and pick this up next week, but the Hasmoneans. So during this time, the cities are pretty much, divided among the Greeks and the Hellenist aspects of the Jews and the more traditional Orthodox members of the Jewish faith that are still trying to practice. They're not, basically Antiochus' policies, Maccabees relay stories of women who let their sons be circumcised were basically taken with their babies and thrown off the city walls. People were forced to eat pork or they would be immediately killed, and it's pretty bad. Well, what Antiochus also said was it wasn't good enough for the Jerusalem people to have to come to this and worship, in the temple to Zeus. I'm actually going to have these portable shrines or temples that I'm going to send out into the countryside, and people are going to have to actually worship me. Well, he goes into this small town of Modin, and one of the priests that was there from the line of Aaron basically is approached and says, "Hey, we want you to show the people, an example by offering a sacrifice on our little shrine we've set up here." He says no, and another Jew steps up and says, "I'll do it for him." Well, that didn't go over well. So this priest's name was Mattathias, and Mattathias kills the Jew that tried to offer the sacrifice in his place, and then turns and kills the official. Woo! Now you stirred up a hornet's nest, right? So he grabs his 5 sons, and he heads to the hills. And over the next several years, he basically conducts guerrilla warfare from the countryside. So he is wildly successful because he's basically operating as a partisan with knowledge of the country. He's got a great intelligence source from his people, and he slowly starts to beat back the Seleucids. Well, Mattathias, within about a year, has died, and his son Judas Maccabees, which Maccabees is a Aramaic word. It means the hammer. He takes over as the military leader, and he just goes nuts, winning time after time. He lost a few, but most times he was able to beat them up by using these tactics of striking out of the hills, doing damage, taking their goods, and eventually he's got enough people, because people start rallying to him, and goods, because he's struck enough of their baggage trains and taken weapons and supplies, and then he's able to start engaging them in war. Okay, at the same time, so if you read it from the Maccabees side, it was all the Maccabees. They were completely, so great, military leaders, etc., that they were able to beat back this mighty Greek things. In reality, there's a lot of truth to that, but in reality, the Seleucids also had a lot of problems at home. And every time that they would be ready to really close, this happened on 2 or 3 occasions, they had the Maccabees pinned in, and they were ready to annihilate them, and they would get word that some usurper back home was trying to take the throne, and they'd have to pull their troops back, okay? And so this happened enough, but eventually, by a few years, the Maccabees are able to retake Jerusalem, reinstall a high priest, and start offering sacrifices again. And when they rededicated the temple, they had a festival about 8 days. Well, it was 8 days. And that became the Feast of Dedication. And they sent a word out to all of the other Jews and said, "Hey, this is what's happened. We've rededicated the temple. We'd ask you to start celebrating this on the anniversary of this event," which was in the winter. It was in December, generally. The lunar calendars don't line up exactly, but we would consider it December. And all the other Jews from all over the world started adopting this, the Jews in Egypt, and so now we've got the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Okay? Now we're going to stop there. I know I haven't kept up with the chart, sorry. We're going to stop there because I'm out of time. Next week, we'll pick up with the Hasmonean dynasty real quick. We're going to talk about where Herod came from as we start getting into the last few years before Christ's return and before the silent years end. And I'll talk, at least introduce or start talking about the Romans and their impact on the situation at that point. So I know I got a lot of looks out there that are like, I'm so lost, and I hear you. If you have any questions, though, let me know, and if I can answer them, I will. If I don't, maybe I can bring them in next week and we can talk about it. All right, thank you.